We've been studying out of the book of Leviticus for the last few weeks, and I want us to back up just a little bit and catch up what we did at the end of last week. We were talking about peace offerings, and we talked about the name a little bit and how the word that is used there that's translated peace is close to shalom. It's a relative of that word, which in essence means living as God would like us to have to be, or as God intended it to be. We looked over in the Levite section in chapter 7, and we learned that the main reasons for the peace offering was either for thanksgiving, the beginning or ending of a vow, or just because of God's goodness, just celebrating God's goodness. We touched base back when we were looking at the burnt offerings, when David numbered the people of Israel and Israel was punished for it. And we saw that David offered a burnt offering and a peace offering. And at that time, I mentioned that we would touch base back on this when we got to the peace offering. And I want us to think for a minute, why did David offer a peace offering? He had already admitted that he had sinned. God had already stopped the punishment, if we look at the way it's worded anyway. So, why a peace offering? Was it because he was thankful? Maybe. Maybe he made a vow not to disobey God again. I don't know. Maybe he was celebrating because God was so good. And you think, well, God just killed 70,000 people. But perspective makes a difference. Remember, he was given 3 choices, and he said, I will rather be at your mercy than the mercy of man. So with that concept, you say, okay, so we kind of get a little bit of an idea of a peace offering here. Excuse me. I wanted us to think for a minute about the difference between the peace offering and the burnt offering. The burnt offering, the entire beast, except for the skin, was offered to God. In the peace offering, the fat, the kidneys, the liver of a cattle, the fat, the liver, the kidneys, and fat tail of a sheep were for the Lord. And we talked about how that was considered the best. And I wanted us to think about, we're going to get to a section in a few minutes about how that the children of Israel were commanded not to eat certain things. And I think part of that ties into this. Also, we noticed that, once again, the offering was a sweet aroma to God. Now, I often wonder if it really smelled good because God is a spirit, or if it was the act that was doing it. But the concept is it was pleasing to God. And so that's kind of where I wanted to start here. If you turn over to Leviticus chapter 7. Excuse me. And now this is the section, there's 2 different sections in these offerings. One is generally accepted as being given to the people. This is what you do. And for the first 3, it said, if your offering is a peace offering, if your offering is a grain offering, if your offering is a burnt offering, this is what you do. And then over in chapter 7, or thereabouts a little bit, there's some movement in there. It gives more detailed instructions, generally considered to be for the priest, and that's where we learned that the peace offering, the reasons for the peace offering, and that was starting in verse 11, and we talked about that and read that. One thing I would like to notice in verses 11 through 14 is that with the peace offering, they were also given grain offerings. If you look, it says, there's grain offerings. And also, it says, you're going to offer loaves of bread. And one of those loaves of bread goes to the priest. And this brings, nowhere do we see in this all of the people that are involved in a peace offering. But we're starting to see that it's more than just the person offering the peace offering. They would have different people come in. Generally, it was people that were close to you. Excuse me, my back is giving me a little fits today, so if I'm stumbling around, I hope it doesn't distract too much. It'd be close family, friends, or people involved in the incident that is bringing about the peace offering. So we're starting to see some of this come together, and that also brings us back to the name of the meat or the grain offering, because that often confuses people. And I'll touch that in just a minute. Let's go. In verse 15, and I'm going to read this out of the King James Version. In verse 15, it reads, "The flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering for thanksgiving shall be eaten on the same day as it is offered. He shall not leave any of it till morning. But if the sacrifice of his offering is a vow of voluntary offering, it shall be eaten the same day that he offers it, his sacrifice. But on the next day, the remainder of it may also be eaten. The remainder of the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day must be burned in fire. If any of the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering is eaten at all on the third day, it shall not be accepted, nor shall it be imputed to him. It shall be an abomination to him who offers it, and the person who eats of it shall bear guilt." So we're seeing this is an interesting thing come in, because the peace offering, as we see, seems to be spread around more people than just the person offering. And one of the reasons I read out of the King James is because it used the word abomination. And we talked about that when we started out. And it was like abomination, when we're talking about a God, is things against God's nature or against God. And here it's almost if it's saying, if he eats it, the person that eats it, it's like an abomination to him if he eats it after the third day, or after the first day, on the third day, or after the first day if it is for Thanksgiving. Why would that be in there? What's the big deal here with the third day after the sacrifice? We really don't know. Some people think it had to do with health issues, but that doesn't make sense when you say, okay, on the Thanksgiving you can't eat it after the first day, but on the vow or the free will you could eat it on the second day. But what do you think of when you think of the third day? Christ rose on the third day. This was a sacrifice. I have no idea if this really ties together or not, but I thought that was an interesting thought. And that's part of what we're looking at these days, to see the shadows that are coming. And you can think this is manly wisdom, not God's wisdom, because we're not told. But it's, okay, here's the sacrifice. Third day, Christ was raised. And if you count hours, it was parts of 3 days. It was only 2 days. So it's kind of like, okay, there's a little symbolism there that helps us connect the two. Whether that's what was meant or not, I don't know. But I thought it was interesting. But it gets even more interesting when you go down the next part. The next section, verses 19 through 21, talk about uncleanness and the peace offering. And it's, when I read this in several different versions, and they all use the term flesh. And the concept of us eating flesh just doesn't fit right with us, because we think of flesh as human flesh and not meat. But that's the concept. It's the flesh of the sacrifice. And the flesh that touches any unclean thing shall not be eaten. It shall be burned with fire. And as for the clean flesh, all who are clean may eat of it. But the person who eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of the peace offering that belongs to the Lord, while he is unclean, that person shall be cut off from his people. Moreover, the person who touches any unclean such as a human uncleanness or an unclean animal or any abominable unclean thing, and who eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of the peace offering that belongs to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from his people. Two things I want us to notice. It was very specific that the sacrifice belonged to the Lord, even though people were eating it. So, that's an interesting data point there. Some of the offering went to the priest, some of the offering the people ate, and part of it was offered to God, but it was all the Lord's. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing there. What did it mean to the children of Israel when they were in the wilderness if they were cut off from the people? How serious was that? Well, what did it mean to if somebody was told they were going to be cut off, what did that mean to them? Not only couldn't they participate, they were not part of the congregation. They were put outside the camp if they were cut off. This was, you think about it, they're depending upon God. They're depending upon this congregation of people to survive, to get to the promised land. Oops, you do this and you're cut off. That's pretty serious. Now, this is an example of how concepts of people change on things. At the time of Jesus, what would it have meant to people to be cut off? They'd still live there. It wasn't the end of their life. It might have been the end of their life if they knew it, their life would change, but it wasn't like it was a death sentence. It almost was a death sentence at the time it was given. And today, what would it mean to be cut off? Oh, well, I'm moving to a different part of the country. See, the same concept varies in our cultures a little bit. To these people, this was serious. If you ate of the peace offering, somebody invited you because you were close to the family and there was a great joy in the family. Maybe they had a grandson, who knows, but they were thanking God, and you were unclean and you went and ate, you were cut off from the people. This was something that's important to understand, and we're going to get to a little bit more of that in just a minute. But I want us to go to the next section where there's a law given about eating fat and blood. Verses 22 through 27. And the Lord spake to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, Ye shall not eat any fat of the ox or sheep or goat, and the fat of the animal that dies naturally, and the fat of that which is torn by wild beasts may be used in other ways. Let's stop there for a minute. What other ways would you use fat? What? Candles? Okay, but that would be eating.
I see what you're saying.
Make oil.
Oil? Soap. There's lots of ways it could be used. And he says, you can use it, you just can't eat it. Okay, so let's keep going. The fat of the animal that dies naturally and the fat that is torn by wild beasts may be used in other ways, but ye shall by no means eat it. For whosoever eats the fat of an animal which men offer as an offering made by fire to the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off from his people. Moreover, ye shall not eat any blood in any of your dwellings, whether of bird or of beast, or whoever eats any blood, that person shall be cut off from his people. Now, we've talked about blood before and it being the source of life, for lack of a better term. And you kind of understand that. Some people also say that it's a health issue, that they were told not to do that for their own good. But it seems to be more of a spiritual issue, as a semblance of life is in the blood, so you don't eat it. And of course, that ties into the New Testament in many ways as well. So what is this fat thing? Why the prohibition against fat?
This is from my Bible study, not from my memory.
Okay.
But it said that it's the abundance of the animal. It's the best part. That's what the fat is, and it's to go to God.
And that's the best explanation we can come up with. And the way they use the term fat. If you go, okay, I got to look at my notes because I don't remember it. If you go to Genesis 45 and 18, Joseph has just talked about bringing his family into Egypt. And the Pharaoh says, hey, bring them, and you can have the fat of the land. It was the best part. Now, I want you to imagine the Hebrews. Now, in the wilderness, I don't guess this would make that much difference because they didn't meet that many other people they weren't fighting. But later on, what would happen when they went into somebody's house and they were offered the best pieces of the meat? The fat, the kidneys, the liver, the fat tail of the sheep. They would say, no, I can't eat that. That's God's. Imagine that impression. And, that's how much these laws moved into their lives. They understood God was their everything, or they were being taught that, maybe I should say. And so this was part of that. And then the last section there, 28 through 34, talks about the priest portions of the peace offering. My brain's not working well this morning. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, whoever offers a sacrifice of his peace offering to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offerings. His own hand shall he bring the Lord's food off. Oops, I'm in the wrong version, excuse me. King James Version. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, he who offers a sacrifice of his peace offering to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offering. His own hand shall he bring the offerings made by fire to the Lord. The fat with the breast he shall bring, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. And the priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast shall be Aaron's and his son. Also the right thigh you shall give to the priest as a heave offering from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. And he among the sons of Aaron who offers the blood of the peace offering and the fat shall have the right thigh for his part. For the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering I have taken from the children of Israel from the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and I have given them to Aaron the priest and to his sons from the children of Israel by a statute forever. The concept of a wave offering and the peace offering, the best I've been able to find is like you take a thigh and you heave it up. And I say, okay, God, it's a heave offering, but then they get to take it. Wave offering is the same type of thing. It would be waved. But it was a symbolic thing that it was God's. Now, I want you to think for a second. The Levites, the priest, this was a lot of their food. I'm not going to say it was the majority because I don't know that. How many offerings did it take for them to feed the priests? How many tribes other than Levites were there? These offerings were in abundance. This was not something that happened once a week, once a day. It was a continual thing. Yes.
So just on that point, I think it makes it even more emphasized when you get to Ezra, that Ezra comes to Israel and the Levites have to go work and work the field because
Nobody's making offerings.
nobody's making offerings, which shows you the corruption, like the absolute corruption of the land. And this was supposed to be a self-fulfilled kind of thing where supposedly take care of you spiritually, teach you, and it frees them up in that way. And when you're not doing that, then they can't do their job. It's
Messes things up. Messes God's plans up. How's that a good way of putting that? Yeah. So as we kind of tie this one together, I want you to think that of these first three offerings that have been made, they all start out, if the offering is a peace offering, if an offering is a grain offering, if an offering is a burnt offering, that's the way these sections start. And so it's this, doesn't say why. It just says if an offering. The concept is, this offering thing is something they did. And we get confused a lot of times, I think, by the names. We get confused with the grain, especially because the word translated, the Hebrews, when they had a guest over or something, they made a meal that included bread and meat. And so it was, a meat offering because they included the bread. It was the way that King James translated that. The New King James, I think, translates it meal. And a lot of translations have gone to grain because that's what it was. But the concept was this was a special offering that consisted of grains. And so this peace offering people are starting to call a fellowship offering because it brought people together. It brought people and God together. But the word used to describe it is peace. And I think that starts to confuse us, especially because we tend to try to relate these offerings to us or to Christ. And it's not a single one. It's a conglomeration. Let me ask you a question. We talked a little earlier about if they were unclean when they ate of the peace offering, they were going to be cut off. Is there anything that reminds you of in the New Testament? 1 Corinthians 11:29. 1 Corinthians 11:29. You hear it quite frequently. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself, or as some versions say, condemnation on himself. Essentially the same thing as being cut off from the people of God. So we see these flavors coming over from the Old Testament, but it's not from, this is the sacrifice that ties specifically to this in the New Testament. It's more of a conglomeration. And now we're going to get into the next offering, which is labeled a sin offering. The word translated sin means sin. That's a good translation. But people are trying to start to describe it, so they're changing the name of it. They're saying purification offering. They're trying to describe it because purification seems to be what it does compared to sin offering and the name of it. So just as you're reading about it, think of that. As we go through, I want you to notice two or three different things. What is purified? What is cleansed? Also notice that in most of the cases when it's talking about it, not all of them, but in most of them, the word atonement is mentioned. And I want you to also notice that as we go through the different sections, the value of the offering goes down. Now, this is the first sacrifice that starts off with a reason for the sacrifice. It says, if a man sin. Before it's always said, if his offering is, this time, if a man sins. So it's giving us a reason for a sacrifice. If you look first at Leviticus 6:24, we're going to start off looking at the Levites section. It's a little concise, talks more about the law about doing it than the actual sacrifice itself. Levi chapter 6, starting in verse 24, going through the end of the chapter. Also the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is killed, the sin offering shall be killed before the Lord. So that would be in front of the tabernacle. It is most holy. The priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. The holy place shall be, the priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. In a holy place it shall be eaten. In the court of the tabernacle of the meeting, everyone who touches its flesh must be holy. And when the blood is sprinkled on any garment, you shall wash that on which it was sprinkled in a holy place. But the earthen vessel in which it is boiled shall be broken. And if it is boiled in a bronze pot, it shall be both scoured and rinsed in water. All the males among the priests may eat it. It is most holy. But no sin offering from which any of the blood is brought into the tabernacle of meeting to make atonement in the holy place shall be eaten. It shall be burned in the fire. So he's setting up something here that doesn't necessarily click with us until we get the whole picture, because there's a bunch of different sections in this. This is for the priests so that they understand what they're doing. And it's pretty much saying, okay, if you're offering a sacrifice for a sin, then you get to eat of this sacrifice. In other words, if Brian was the priest and I had brought a sin sacrifice in, then the priest would get to eat of that sacrifice. There's another section that says that if I as a priest brought an offering in, that the priest offering wouldn't get to eat that. Yes, ma'am.
I get a migraine just trying to keep up with the logistics of the sacrifices. I mean, I had to have a cheat sheet just to know what I was supposed to do.
Don't feel bad about that.
How, you got these millions of people, and you've got all these animals, did they put all you with the lane offering go over here, all of you with the sin offering over here? I mean, was it just constant, next one up with the sin offering, and we got to do this? The logistics of it.
Well, part of what we're not given is their day-to-day operations. How did they manage it? But you can imagine seeing, okay, how many hundreds of people coming to the temple a day bringing an animal to be sacrificed. So yes, it could get, but by the same token, it was this, now remember, it wasn't all of the Levites that were priests. Only the children, the descendants of Aaron, were priests. The rest were just Levites. They helped, but they weren't priests. They weren't anointed as priests. So there's a relatively limited number of people compared to the entire group that is dealing with this day in and day out. So yes, and you can imagine, okay, somebody brings in a peace sacrifice. This is a peace sacrifice. I'm giving it to God. Lay the hand on the head of the animal. That's on almost all of them. Kill it. The blood is splashed in specific places. It's carved up. Certain pieces are offered on the altar. Certain pieces are either returned to the offerer in a peace offering, and certain pieces go to the priest for their food. So there is an order to it. And it's kind of like people that do the same thing over and over every day at work kind of know what's going on. I've always been amazed at Kathy. When she was working, this was 40 years ago. She's not that old. She was working in a place and she was helping with inventory. And she'd spat out these numbers that long and know exactly what it was and where it was in the warehouse. Well, as you do things like this, a lot of that comes in, I think. I think there's a lot of it's that there. To us, we're not doing this. We're not going to do this. So the details, I think, sometimes are not that important. But specifically when they remind us of stuff, it might help us understand the importance of it in a spiritual sense.
Daryl, you touched on it. We have to understand the why. They,
Understood the why.
these Israelites understood the why and the how. But looking at it from a broad picture of the things that you've talked about today, you know, like you can imagine the spoilage that would go on if they didn't have demands on when you eat it, and you know, it's like having someone over for dinner that's a special person, and you have some old moldy food in the refrigerator and you bring out, you know, God wants the best, and later on we know the foreshadow of this is right now they have the better stuff. Later on the sacrifice will be the best, that being Christ. So the stuff needs to be right, it needs to be good, and they need to be obedient. If they're disobedient, it's an offering. They're not demanded. You need to make an offering today. It's like, no, if you want peace with God, if you want atonement, if you bring an offering to Him,
Right.
you might receive peace and atonement and such, if your heart's right.
Well, in some cases it says, yeah, they would, but then we also find that if they didn't do it, we talked about the Amos passage where he didn't accept their offering. So we've got to keep, we're blessed in that we can see all of that. And we're reading through this, and we don't always understand the whys and wherefores of some of this stuff. And that's okay. It's not for us. But what we can understand is its relationships and their relationship to God, which I think is the big part of this study. They were learning how to live with God in their midst. We are learning how to live with God in us. There's a big correlation there. So that's one of the reasons why I think this study is so interesting. Sure.
So the priests are eating
Parts.
parts of it, and we have hundreds of people that are doing this today. Are they eating all of it, or are they eating a piece of it, and moving on to the next one?
Well, realize that let's take, for instance, the peace offering we were just talking about. The priest that makes the offering, that actually does the offering for the person bringing the peace offering, got the left thigh. They got the left thigh. Did that mean they have to eat it that day? Depended on the peace offering, because there was a time limit on it. But it was like, okay, they're not just them, but their family. Now, some of these had to be, the sin offering, we'll notice, had limits on it. It had to be eaten in a holy place. What were holy places? Can you name them?
Altars, temples.
Well, inside the court, inside the tabernacle, and the Holy of Holies are the three, those were the holy places, really.
And that meant their families couldn't share in it too, right? Because they couldn't go in there.
That's part of it, is understanding something. So some of this, yes, it is very limited. Some of it, it's not. And the ones that are limited, you'll also notice that it says, oh, you can't eat it after a certain time, such as with the peace offering. It says, oh, it's got to be burned up. So, yes, it is strange and different in some ways. But on the sin offering,
How many animals was killed today?
we don't know, but I'm sure it was a lot.
Look like all the animals would be dead and they wouldn't have nothing to say.
It's funny you mention that. What she said is it seems like all the animals would be dead. But I want you to think of, this brings up the point of the children of Israel. Their clothes didn't wear out in the 40 years they were in the wilderness. They were fed with manna and quail. So they didn't have to eat their herds on a daily basis. Think of how God was taking care of them. And yes, I feel He was blessing their herds and flocks as well. So, that's, do you understand how much in the wilderness they were dependent upon God? They didn't understand it.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, Daryl. And what she said, they don't be dead. I don't think so, because God would have been providing all that for them to do those sacrifices.
Okay, now, and I'm getting ahead of my outline here, so forgive me when I get back to it. But now, think about us. Is God providing for us? Do we realize it? Most of the time, yeah, I think we don't. This is why this is so interesting to me, is because of these correlations. Are they cause and effect? Not necessarily, but they help me to understand and to see, wait a minute, he was taking care of their very lives in the wilderness. Now, he is taking care of my very life in the wilderness of sin. So, should I be thankful? Should I be offering an offering of a burnt offering? Maybe not a burnt offering, but something of that. I want this to go to God. God deserves the very best. And of course, there's a passage that talks about our reasonable offering somewhere in there. We quote it a lot. So, it's that type of thing that I think really needs to come out in here. So how far did I get reading this? Oh, I got it all. Okay. So when they were offering a sin offering, the priest would eat it. If it was boiled in a clay pot, you couldn't use that pot anymore. It was broken. If it was a brass pot, it was scoured. It was clean. You start seeing this type of careful handling of this really, really, really important things. Now, let's jump back over to where he's giving the instructions. We're going to start in Leviticus 4, verses 1 and 2. And I was about 16 pages further in my outline, in my plans today. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, change to the King James Version. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally against the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them. Okay, let's stop there for a minute. How do you sin unintentionally? What does that mean?
Not aware of the law.
Not aware of the law is one possibility. There's another major possibility. You didn't realize that you were doing it at the time.
Like something you didn't know it was
Unclean, and you touched it, and then you went and ate of a peace offering. Yeah, that is so if somebody sins or trespasses against God's law, or all the things it's not done, and in some versions putting against God's things, then this is what applies. Now, I'm going to throw this out here, but we're not going to answer it now. What if it is intentionally? Okay? Just keep that in your mind as we go on, because there's other places we'll look at. So, verse 3, if the anointed priest sins, okay, so this is the way this is going to work. It starts out, he says, if the anointed priest sins, then it goes to, if the congregation sins and the elders or the assembly don't recognize it, and then it goes down to if a ruler sins, or a prince, as some versions say, think of the heads of the tribes. And then it goes down, I have to go look, make sure I get my stuff right order and remember it all. To the individuals. It goes down, if an individual sins, and then it gives us some specific rules about specific sins, I should say. So we're going to start with these, and we're going to start first with the priest. Now, interestingly enough, there is a debate, I guess is the best term. It says, when the anointed priest, and many people think that that means the high priest. And it's quite possible, and in fact, in this case, I think it does. The high priest was the only priest that was anointed on the head. The rest of the priests were anointed, just not on the head. So one of the reasons why there's a debate here is because if you notice in this list of the different people that sin, the priests aren't mentioned. So while this talks about what I believe is most likely the high priest here, it's possible that all of the priests fell in here too. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you will notice the things that are cleaned or cleansed or purified. If the high priest sins, then the area inside the holy place is cleansed. Not the most holy. The high priest only went in there once a year. And who could go into the holy place? The priests. Who could go into the courtyard? Children of Israel. So that's part of what I want you to notice as we go through this, is what is cleansed and where it is and what not. So on the high priest, let me get back over here to my Bible. If the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, and that's another phrase there, high priest could sin but not bring guilt on the people. How did he bring guilt on the people? The high priest sins and does something that causes the people to sin. He's bringing guilt on the people. That's one way. Okay? For a good example, building the golden calf. Okay? Another thing that could happen, and this is maybe less tied in, but still a factor, is the fact that when somebody very high up in whatever organization or group it is does something that is wrong, it reflects on everybody. Misleading people. Today, I don't know if parents are still doing it today, but when I would do something, my parents would say, "You're making us look bad." And of course, I did a lot of stupid things, so, But I do a lot of stupid things. My wife gave me a funny look. So, the concept is bringing sin on other people. He says, if it's not just him, is the concept here. Bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin which he has sinned a young bull without blemish as a sin offering. He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of the meeting before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the bull's head and kill the bull before the Lord. Then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. Stop right there. What was the veil of the sanctuary? That's what it was. So he's cleaning the inside area, specifically here in front of the veil of the holy place and the veil between the holy and holy of holies. So that was part of what I was talking about before. Verse 7, and the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of the sweet incense before the Lord. Where was the altar of incense? In the holy place. Okay? So we see he's cleaning these things that are where? What's the importance of the Holy of Holies and the holy place? Where God was. So why is it important that that be cleaned?
What you see with these is that sin not only defiles you, it defiles the area in which you're around. And so not only do you have to clean yourself, you have to clean the space, your environment. And that's what some of these things are in some of these sacrifices.
And these were things that were holy. What's holy? They were dedicated to the service of God. So yes, absolutely, they had to be clean. So that's what we're seeing being clean from this sacrifice. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary, and the priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar. Oops, that was not what I meant to do. Excuse me. Altar of the sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting, and shall pour the remaining blood at the base of the altar of the burnt offering. That's the one that's outside, which is at the door of the tabernacle of the meeting. He shall take from it all of the fat of the bull as the sin offering, the fat that covers the entrails, the fat which is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys. You know, I get the feeling, our time's up, but I want to make this point real quick here, that I get the feeling that he's really honing in, saying, this fat, that fat, that. You know, he's making sure that nobody can come around and say, well, he didn't say this piece. You see that? And I think that's something we need to take in, that, you know, when it says we're to be a living sacrifice, that's not just talking about on Sunday mornings. It's all of it. And I'm going to stop there for this week since the second bell has rung. Thank you for your attention and your comments.